Hey there and welcome to my kitchen. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make your own kombucha at home. So this is actually something that I have been meaning to teach here online for a number of months now because I am always amazed at the amount of messages and replies that I get whenever I post anything about our homemade kombucha on social media or anywhere else online. But I thought now was a really good time to teach this, especially because at the time of this recording, it is still April 2020. We are still under quarantine in a lot of areas, and that means that accessing certain things that we might buy from the grocery store is getting a little bit more difficult. Sometimes we're not finding everything that we're used to. And if you are somebody who enjoys having a little bit of a fancy drink every once in a while, if you like to have a soda pop or any type of flavored carbonated beverage, or if you purchase kombucha from the store already, having your own homemade kombucha is a really great substitute for those type of drinks. Personally, in our house, we don't drink any soda because it's just really bad for you. We do a little bit of homemade soda that we actually use our soda stream for, and we'll make our own kind of syrups to go in that. But that's about the extent of it. But even so, you know, you kind of grow tired. We don't drink a lot of that because of the sugar content, and we kind of grow tired of just drinking water all the time, even carbonated water. Every once in a while, I want something a little bit different, a little bit more flavorful, and having our own homemade kombucha allows us to have that, but is a way, way, way healthier option than things like soda because the sugar content is way less. And if you do purchase kombucha from the store, making your own at home is way more affordable. I have basically calculated out that when we make about a gallon of kombucha at home and then we bottle it up and flavor it, we get about the same amount that would cost us around $50 to $60 if we were to buy the bottles from the store. So, and it's only costing us literal pennies to make per batch. So what is kombucha? So kombucha is a fermented tea. So, and as we are all becoming more and more aware, fermented foods are incredibly good for our gut health and our microbiome. And more studies are showing that our immunity and our overall health is really tied to our gut health and that microbiome in our body. And so fermented foods in particular and probiotics are really important to keep that gut health in check, right? To keep everything running smoothly. And that is going to help us with overall health and to boost our immunity and all that good stuff. All you need to start off is either some black tea, some green tea will also work, or white tea works too. Don't use any herbal teas, at least not when you're doing your first ferment, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. You really do want to start, you either have to start with a black tea, green tea, or white tea for kombucha to work properly. You can always flavor it with herbal teas later on, but we'll get into that later. So all you need to start is a little bit of tea. You can have it either tea bags or loose leaf tea. I always like to start with organic just so that I'm not transferring any pesticides or anything like that because tea is a highly sprayed crop as well. So I always like to make sure that I'm starting with organic tea, but otherwise just any regular old black, green, white tea will do. And then all you need after that is some sugar and water. And then you'll also need something called a SCOBY. So if you have seen anybody make kombucha before, or if you've maybe done it yourself, then you might already know what a SCOBY is or have seen one before. But if you haven't, brace yourself because I know that they really freak people out if they've never seen one or aren't used to it. So this, what I've got here, this is my gallon jar and I call it my SCOBY hotel, or I don't just call it that, that's what it's called. So this is where you store your extra SCOBYs, and you need a SCOBY to start off a batch, your first batch of kombucha, and then they actually start to multiply. So a SCOBY looks like this. It is not a sea creature. It is not a mushroom. It is not mold. It is basically the bloom that forms on the top of your kombucha tea as it is fermenting. So SCOBY is spelled S-C-O-B-Y, and it stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. And that is essentially what helps your kombucha tea to ferment. Now, if you're wondering where you might get these things, we got ours. We started off with, actually it was just a half a SCOBY that I got from a friend. and he had extra because, like I said, they actually multiply. The more batches, every batch of kombucha that you make with one, it will actually produce another SCOBY, so they build up really quickly. So I started off with half of a SCOBY that my friend actually cut in half and gave to me with a little bit of the starter liquid. And then I started brewing my own at home. And then, like I say, every batch that we brewed, you get another SCOBY off of that. And we have now collected them. And they're in this SCOBY hotel where they kind of live until I need them. Some of them I've given away or thrown in the compost. Now we have chickens, and chickens actually really like SCOBYs as well, and they're really good for them because they are, again, fermented. And I even heard of people tossing extras like in their blender and stuff for a really good boost of probiotics. I have not gone that far, but I got mine locally. So that's always an option. You can, if you know anybody who brews kombucha, ask them if they have a SCOBY to spare, because chances are they do, because they reproduce all the time. Otherwise, you can ask in local Facebook groups. Just ask around in any local Facebook groups, does anybody have a SCOBY? Oftentimes, you can either get one for free because people have extra, or they'll charge a few dollars, maybe $5 or $10 for a SCOBY, or you can purchase one online and have it sent to you. So Amazon actually sells SCOBYs in packages with a little bit of starter liquid that you can order and then start your own batch from that. And then you'll never have to buy it again as long as you keep it going. It will continue to produce new SCOBYs. So it's a very, even if you do pay a few dollars up front to get a SCOBY, it's a very nominal upfront cost. And then you can continue to brew kombucha indefinitely for really no more than it costs for the tea and the sugar that you use in your batches. So it's extremely affordable to brew it at home, especially compared to what it costs you from the store. The other nice thing about brewing your own kombucha at home is that you have total control over the flavoring. So when it comes to flavoring kombucha, the options are pretty much endless. There are so many things you can do with it. You can use fruit to flavor it. You can use tea. We're going to go into that in this second video, the second part to this video, which will be all about flavoring it. But for today, we're going to start off, and I'm going to show you how to do the first ferment. So basically, brewing kombucha happens in two stages. There's the first ferment, and then there's the second ferment. And it's really simple. I'm going to show you how we do the first part today, and then again, I will show you the second part on part 2 of this video. But it is a very simple process, but I think people often think that it's difficult because it takes some time. But most of the time is spent with it just sitting on the counter. That's all you're doing to let it ferment. So you're just doing a little bit of really, really simple, easy work up front. And then there's about a week or so that you want to just leave it sit on the counter, and then you're going to do your second ferment. But I think it's that amount of time in between that trips people up, and they think, oh, that takes so long. I can't do all that work. Most of the time, though, it's completely hands-off and you're not actually doing any work. So today for the first ferment, I'm going to show you how to get a batch of kombucha started and get it brewing. So for the first time that you make kombucha, so you're going to have your SCOBY, you're going to have some of your starter liquid. You're going to want to make sure that you have some sugar, of course. You're going to have to get your tea ready. So today I am using a green tea. I'm using this Farmhouse Teas brand. They are so awesome. So Farmhouse Teas, you can get all sorts of loose leaf tea off of their website, and they have a whole section that's actually dedicated specifically to kombucha. So if you're really not sure what to get, there is a section where you can get tea for your first ferment, and they carry black and green teas. You can choose your tea from there, and they have some different kind of flavorings and blends for their first one, for their first ferment, and then you can also choose your flavored herbal teas to flavor your batch on the second ferment. So I really, really love the teas from Farmhouse Teas, and I will drop a link to them below the video so you can check them out if you like. But today I'm going to be using the Mossy Rock Kombucha Blend green tea blend for starting off my batch of kombucha. So you have your sugar, your tea, your SCOBY, and your starter liquid, and then you're going to need some type of a vessel that you're going to keep it in. So you can either use a quart jar, or you can do a half gallon or a gallon. I do the gallons because I've got these large glass gallon jars, which again, I can link to some of these that you can grab yourself. I find these are excellent for drinks because quart jar I just never find is big enough, but this will usually give me about 3 or so of these bottles worth, maybe even a little bit more. So I like to brew them in gallons because then it's kind of worth the wait time. I've got enough to drink then for the next little while. So you'll need some type of a glass jar. You'll need something to brew your tea in. So I've just got, because I'm using loose leaf tea, I've got one of these teapots with the little strainer inside, or if you're using tea bags, but just a teapot just to do your initial brewing of your tea, and then you're gonna transfer it into here after. And that's pretty much it. So the first thing you're gonna do is boil some water. Okay, so I've already got my water boiled here in my kettle. I've just done just a full pot basically because I'm doing a gallon. So I'm gonna take my teapot, and because I'm doing a gallon, I'm gonna start off with 2 tablespoons of loose leaf tea. So if you're doing a gallon, you can either use 2 tablespoons of loose leaf tea or 8 tea bags. If you're just doing a quart-sized jar, then you will need a half a tablespoon of tea or 2 tea bags to start. So, I use this spoon. This I use, it's kind of specifically something that I use for my kombucha, and it is called the Perfect Teaspoon, I believe. This is by David's Tea, but it's basically, I think it's equal to about 2 teaspoons, but I kind of do a heaping spoon of this, or 2 heaping spoons of this, sorry, for a gallon, and that always seems to be the perfect amount for my kombucha. So if you have measuring spoons, you can just use a tablespoon, but I like having, because I have this anyway, I like using this dedicated perfect teaspoon for my kombucha. So I will link to a similar spoon below if you'd like to get yourself a dedicated spoon for your kombucha making. So I'm just going to go ahead and do 2 heaping spoons, perfect teaspoons full, or 2 tablespoons of tea into my teapot there. And then pour in my hot water. So you're just brewing this like you would brew a normal pot of tea. And there's no kind of set amount for how much tea you need to brew. Like a teapot like this is probably enough. And then I end up filling a little bit of this jar up with some cold water. So there's no set amount of how much water you necessarily need to put in when you're doing your initial brewing of the tea. Just do about, I use about a teapot, and then I will fill the gallon up with some cooler water and then add my starter liquid once that water has cooled down. So I'm gonna go ahead and let this tea brew, and I like to brew it for about 5 minutes. So I always set a timer for 5 minutes so that I don't forget about it, because I have forgotten about it before, and then I've used it and it's been really bitter. You know, just like if you leave a regular pot or cup of tea to brew for too long and then you drink it after, it's got a really bitter taste because it's almost extracted too much of that tea flavor. So I'm gonna let that sit for 5 minutes, and then I'm gonna come back and show you how we do the rest. Okay, so our timer's gone off. It's been 5 minutes, so that means it is time to strain my tea and get brewing our first ferment of kombucha. I'm just going to go ahead and pour my tea into here. Okay, so as you can see, it's only filled up maybe about a quarter of the gallon jar, but that's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and add in some more water. So I'm just going to use some tap water. Okay, so I've filled it up about to about 2/3 of the way, just with some tap water. You want to try not to use chlorinated water or anything like that. So if your water is highly chlorinated, you may want to boil that first and add some more water in after it's boiled. It can either be hot or you can add some cooler water. I like to add cold water just because then that brings the temperature down a little bit, because when I do go add my SCOBY in, I don't want it to be scorching hot because that can kill it. So adding a little bit of cold water into my gallon just helps to bring down the temperature a little bit. But I want to fill it up to about 2/3 of the way, and then I'm going to add my sugar in. So you can add the sugar in before you fill it up with water as well. This is just kind of my system, so I usually fill it up to about 2/3 of the way, and then I go ahead and I add a cup of sugar. Just plain old white sugar. So if you're doing a gallon, it's a cup of sugar. And if you're doing a quart, then it is a 1/4 cup of sugar. And I'm just going to pour that in. Now you might be going, oh my God, look at all that sugar going in there. How is that healthier than soda? And the reason is because it is fermented, what happens is when you leave it out for the week to ferment, it actually eats the sugar. So the SCOBY, as it ferments the tea, actually feeds on the sugar that is in here. Oh, and I need to get a spoon. Got my wooden spoon. And I like to just use wooden spoons. I try to not to use any type of metal or anything else like that with kombucha, just because with fermented foods, that can react. So I always use a glass jar. I don't use any type of metal spoons or utensils or anything like that it might react with. But so what happens is the SCOBY basically feeds on the sugar, and as the tea ferments, the longer that it ferments, the more sugar basically disappears from it. And by the time it's ready for you to drink, there is very little sugar left in it, just trace amounts actually. And in fact, when I did the keto diet last year for a little while, and that is basically so low sugar, it's almost no sugar, but kombucha was allowed in the keto diet because by the time it is ready to be consumed, like I say, there is so little sugar left because of the fermentation process that is actually considered a very, very low sugar item. So even though you're starting off with a cup of sugar, don't chintz on it. I helped my mom make a batch of this the other week, and she was horrified to be adding a cup of sugar to it. And so we want you to add a little bit less, but you really do want to follow the recipe if you want to ensure that you get your kombucha to ferment nicely. So put the whole cup in, follow the instructions, follow the recipe, and just don't worry, because that sugar will begin to kind of dissipate over time the longer it is left to ferment. So from there, because I added some cooler water, and my hands are clean, I'm just gonna kind of stick it in and check. So this is good. This is about a little bit warmer than room temperature right now, but it is certainly not scalding hot. If it is hot, you definitely want to let it just sit and come down to about room temperature before you add your SCOBY in. But the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in 2 cups of starter liquid, and that's going to bring the temperature down even more. So there's really no right or wrong order to how you do things. You could add your starter tea first and then add your freshly brewed tea and then top that up with some water if you need to. But I always like to add the hot tea first, cool it down with a little bit of water so it's not scorching hot, and then add my other ingredients, because I don't want the hot water to kill any of the, to kill the SCOBY or the good bacteria in the starter liquid, which is basically just kombucha that has been left over that I'm going to use to give it a little bit of a jump start on fermenting. So again, when you order a SCOBY, if you don't have one yet, it will come in a little bit of starter liquid. If you don't have enough of it to start a batch, you can always purchase just a bottle of kombucha from the store and use the liquid from that to get going. I can see I've actually got a little tiny SCOBY in here. So something like that, I'm not gonna bother saving. I'm just gonna put that aside and probably feed it to the chickens. Or again, you can toss it in your compost as well. So if you need to get some more liquid, I would recommend just purchasing just a bottle of kombucha from the store just to get you started, and using the liquid from that. I have heard of people using vinegar, apple cider vinegar in particular, but I've heard kind of mixed results from different sources. And I've heard from many sources that you really shouldn't add your vinegar into your kombucha, because it can just affect the fermentation process in the future. So I stick to just using kombucha. If you don't have enough of the starter liquid, like I say, you can just buy some from the store, or you can start with a smaller batch. So if you only have, you know, a quarter cup of your starter liquid or half a cup, then just start off by making yourself a quart, and then save that liquid, and then you can work up to a gallon. So I'm gonna add in my 2 cups of starter liquid to my gallon jar. Okay. Give that another little stir. I'm just gonna check that again. So that's at a really good temperature. If I needed to cool it down a little bit more, I could even add a little bit more water if I like, but I'm gonna stick with that. That's a good, pretty much room temperature now. Little tiny bit warmer. If it's a little tiny bit warmer than room temperature, or around room temperature, it's good for the SCOBY, because it will help to get that fermentation process started. You don't really want to be starting off with cold liquid that's come out of the fridge or something like that. So you want your liquid to at least be at room temperature, but if it is too hot to put your finger in, it is too hot to put your SCOBY in. So just check it out and make sure that it is lukewarm. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna take one of my SCOBYs out, and I am just going to pop that right in there. And then I'm going to just put something on top. So I like to use these coffee filters. You can use cheesecloth as well, just to keep any unwanted foreign objects out of your kombucha. So any kind of fluff or hairs or dust or dirt or bugs especially. It is April right now, so we don't have too many bugs flying around, but when you make kombucha in the summer, it is like a super attractor of fruit flies. So you definitely want to have something that's going to keep the fruit flies out during the summer. And I find that a coffee filter is the best way to do that because it allows the kombucha to breathe. You don't want to put a airtight lid on the jar, but the coffee filter will allow it to breathe without letting any of those bugs in. Even when I have doubled and tripled up cheesecloth before, those tiny little fruit flies find their way in. Oh my goodness, they do it every year. So I've moved to the coffee filters as long as there's no holes in it. You're safe from bugs and debris, but your kombucha can still breathe and start to ferment your first batch. So that is basically it. And all you're going to do from here is set it aside on your counter and just leave it. So you can basically leave this to ferment on your counter for anywhere from about 5 days to, I usually do within about 2 weeks. So I find the sweet spot is usually about 1 week to 10 days for my liking, but you can taste it after about 5 days or so. Just dip a little spoon in or something to have a little taste and see if you like the taste. And if you like it, at that point, you can actually go ahead and do your second ferment. But what I find is after about 5 days, it's still a little bit sweet for me. There's still sugar left over in there. There's still quite a bit of it, and I find it too sweet. So I usually find that by about day 7 or so, it's starting to be, it's just sweet enough that it is tasty, but it is not so sweet that it is overly sweet anymore. And that is a really good time to then take it and do your second ferment, which I will go over in part 2. But I have also left it up to 2 weeks and probably even a little bit longer. The longer that you leave it, the more sugar disappears and it'll taste a little bit more on the vinegar side. So it'll be less sweet and a little bit more tangy. Now you can technically let it go too long where you taste it and it's like, whoa, that is straight vinegar. In that case, you probably don't want to do your second ferment and turn it into a drink, but you can still use it. You can use it as a salad dressing, just like you would with apple cider vinegar, or add a little bit of it to your smoothie in the morning just for a little hit of probiotics. So you can certainly use it. You just might not want to actually use it to brew your flavored kombucha if it's too vinegary. So I usually find the sweet spot is somewhere between about 7 and 10 days, but you just taste it as you go. And once it's to a point where you're like, you know what, that's a good flavor. It's not too sweet for me. It's kind of just right, the Goldilocks zone, then you're ready to do your second ferment. So for the second ferment, you're basically going to take that tea that has brewed, and by the time you're ready to do your second ferment, you will see that another SCOBY has started to form on the top of your jar, and you'll be ready to do your second ferment, and that is when the real fun happens. So that's when we get into flavoring your kombucha, and you can kind of get as creative as you want at this point. And as far as storing your other SCOBYs goes, so if you need to store them while you're not using them, like I say, you keep them at least in a little bit of the liquid that they need to kind of live in and feed off of, and then just keep them in a jar, just like the jar that I'm using to do my first ferment. And then you can just keep them in their little SCOBY hotel, and I just keep mine in the pantry. So I just keep it in kind of a cool, dark place at room temperature, and they'll be good whenever you go to use them. As long as you're using your kombucha or brewing a new batch once a month or every couple months, that seems to be enough to keep them going, because I always add a little bit more starter tea back into my SCOBY hotel. And then that helps to continue to feed them. So then I just store that in the pantry. So I'm gonna let this brew here for the next week, and I will be back, if you're watching this kind of in real time, I will be back next week to show you part 2 of brewing our kombucha. So we'll be doing our second ferment. And of course, if you're watching this later on, then I will link to part 2 down below. And I also have a free printable kombucha making guide. So if you want to have the recipe and instructions and some of my favorite flavoring options all printed out and readily available for you, which I always like to have mine printed out because for some reason, no matter how many times I make it, I always have to double check the recipe, double check my ratios to make sure I get it right. So if you want to grab that, you can actually grab that from the kitchen and pantry resources section of my free resource library. So if you've not signed up for that yet, I will leave a link to that below as well, and go get yourself signed up for free, get into that free resource library, and then you can get your free downloadable kombucha guide from there. That's all for now, and I will be back next week for the second ferment.